Welcome in, everyone. You're listening to Bull Central, and keeping on the theme of having guest appearances during the off season, I'm actually joined by none other than the GOAT himself. You know him for all of his great work over at CHGO and the CHGO Pod and covering the team on the beat. It's my pleasure to welcome back to the show Will the GOAT Gottlieb of CHGO. Will, appreciate you making the time, man, and it's good to have you on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back. It's been a while, so I'm excited to chat some bulls with you.
Is it weird when people call you the GOAT? Like, does that like make you feel uncomfortable or anything like that?
What's funny is actually like in high school, my brother was always Gottlieb, and nobody ever
Oh,
called me
interesting.
that. And so, like when CHGO started, I think they just Matt and Dave pulled it out because it works, and now that's me, I guess.
The
Although I
the
still
reason I
call my
ask is
brother that too.
because
So
I used to have Rob Schaefer on back when he was at NBC Sports Chicago, and they used to call him the Young Goat, and
shout
I
out to the young
mentioned
guy.
that, and I was like, "So where'd that come from?" He's like, "It always makes me feel really uneasy." It was Adam and Mean said it once, and now everyone's using it. So yeah, that's the reason I asked.
It's
But
definitely a little strange of a nickname because like I'm not one to really call myself that kind of thing, but it
right, right.
does it does make sense with my last name, so I'll allow it.
Well, anyway, guys, now, of course, I'm sure, most of you are already, but if you're not, give Will a follow at Will_Gottlieb. Be sure to check out all the great work over at chgo.com, as well as subscribe to the CHGO Bulls podcast and YouTube channel that Will does with my guys, also Matt Peck and Big Dave. They keep the content going all season long, even in the off season. They're still doing shows every day, Monday through
5 days a
Friday.
week.
So make sure you tune in on those as well. Now, we'll talk about the Bulls, the offseason. I did want to talk about draft prospects. We did get some breaking news probably about a half hour ago for those watching. We're recording this Tuesday afternoon. Alex Caruso selected to second team all defense. Want to get your thoughts. I know you kind of tweeted about it just a little bit ago, and those were my sentiments as well, right? Is this because they made this position list now, right? It kind of forced all these guards that are incredible perimeter defenders down to the second team when some of them probably should be deserving of all NBA first team defense, which I think Alex Caruso personally should have been. I think it also didn't help the Bulls overall were not as good on defense this year when they were top 5 last year, but wanted to get your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, when you make the all defensive teams positionless, like of course centers are going to be the ones that get the majority of the attention because you typically are building your defense around a center, right? Like if you
Right.
can funnel the ball handler into the paint and you have a great rim protector down there, you're in a good position to take away those shots at the rim, force, more difficult contested pull-up jump shots in the mid-range area, or just like get teams to have to kick it out and start over their offense from scratch, like halfway through the shot clock. So I think, traditionally big men are a more valuable position on the defensive spectrum. But when you look at the Bulls specifically, I mean, they had Nikola Vucevic, who, I think is a little bit unfairly maligned for his defense. Like he's been a part of good defenses before. I think he executes his role within the scheme as well as he can, given his physical limitations. But he's
Right.
not like a elite rim protector like Rudy Gobert or any of those guys down there. So the Bulls have really built their defensive system around their ability to cut off actions at the point of attack. And nobody in the league, in my opinion, does that better than Alex Caruso. He is an
Yeah.
absolute madman on the ball. He is one of the smartest defensive players in rotation and playing off the ball. He guards 1 through 4. There were times where he was guarding Giannis and Zion last year. There were times when he was guarding Steph Curry. So he
Right.
really does it all. And I think when you make the defensive teams positionless, it's a little bit different to me than like the All NBA teams. The All NBA teams, like
Yeah.
you want to have the 5 best players in
Yeah.
each team, right? Because
Right.
offense is a little bit more positionless, but defense, I think that kind of marginalizes and devalues the importance of perimeter defense. And I think for a lot of teams, maybe the Bulls more than anybody else, that is really important. And Caruso does it, like I said, better than anyone. So it's not a slight to Caruso, second team all defense. There's 10 players that make that team. It's a great honor. And I know he was very excited about it. So not to, marginalize what he's done, but I wouldn't be opposed to them kind of moving back towards the traditional, not necessarily like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, but guards and bigs or guards, wings, and a big or something like that to kind of even the scales a little bit, because of course it's going to be all, shot blocking centers down there.
Were there any other surprises between the 10 players and where they were selected, or any snubs for that matter?
I'm going back and just looking at the team. So it was Rudy Gobert, Victor, Bam, Anthony Davis, and Herb Jones on the first team, and then Caruso, Drew Holiday, Jaden McDaniels, Jalen Suggs, and Derek White. I mean, I think that makes sense. Like those are probably the 10 guys that I would want. Those are, in my opinion, like the 10 maybe best defensive players in the league.
Yeah,
Isaiah Hartenstein was really good this year, but he didn't qualify for the minutes because of like, I mean, he played enough games, but he didn't necessarily play as many minutes as he needed to within
yeah.
games. Kawhi Leonard's obviously somebody that you could maybe throw in there, but I think all things considered, those are like the right 10 guys.
So let's shift gears real quick and talk about the draft and prospects. So obviously, the Bulls have the 11th pick in this upcoming draft, and what's being viewed as a pretty weak draft class overall, but that shouldn't take away from the fact that there is talent in this class and gems that can be found in the right places. I know you talked about this, to an extent, obviously in some of your recent shows, but based on your coverage of the combine and talking to the players, watching them go through drills, what's your take overall on this draft class, and what are the opportunities here for the Bulls with the 11th selection?
Yeah, super interesting draft class just because there's no Wembanyama at the top,
Right.
obviously. But there's also no Scoot Henderson. There's no Brandon Miller. There's really not even like an Amen Thompson, maybe an Asar Thompson. So I
Right.
think like maybe all five of those guys might go number one in this draft. But like you're saying, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not good value to be had later on in the lottery and in the first round. Like I do think there are a lot of contributing level role players, mid to even high level starters potentially down the line for some of these guys. So I do think that's an opportunity for the Bulls to, have the right guy kind of fall to them. They're not necessarily going to be the ones at the top of the draft taking the big swings, because in this draft, like those big swings might result in a bust. So I don't think it's necessarily a terrible thing that they didn't move up in this draft. Now, last year would have been great. Next year definitely would be great. But I do think there's going to be opportunities to get a contributor at this 11 spot. And I think there are definitely some guys that are interesting. Even I know a lot of people don't want to draft another guard. You feel like you've got Coby and Io and Zach still on the team, and Lonzo maybe comes back. But I think there are some good guards. I think there are some good wings. Some of the bigs, maybe a little bit of a reach at 11, but with this draft being kind of as even as it is, it wouldn't surprise me if the Bulls did decide to go that direction. So I think they have a lot of options. And I think in that sense, it's kind of nice to let some of the other players fall off the board and then just kind of take whoever falls to you. But then the other piece of that is, all these teams are looking at the players and saying, well, there's not really anybody that we're in love with here. There's nobody that's going to be a franchise changing player. Maybe we can move down and pick
Mm.
something up. And from the Bulls perspective, maybe they love someone and they can maybe move up in the draft a little bit more cheaply than they would in other years where there's really a defined hierarchy. So definitely some opportunity, whether they stay or want to trade up or even move back.
That actually is one thing I wanted to ask you about that I feel like hasn't been talked about very much is whether the Bulls will actually trade this pick, whether it means trading up or down in the draft or just trading the pick to get, another player in a package deal. They obviously can't trade the pick until draft night because of the pick they owe to the Spurs next year in 2025. But have you been hearing anything on your end as far as whether the Bulls are actually looking at something like that, right? Maybe shipping that pick to actually acquire some win now type talent, given the fact that a lot of these players are project players that probably can't contribute right away if the goal ultimately is to still be competitive.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation that the Bulls have found themselves in. Even these two assistant coaching hires to me kind of indicate that they're not necessarily gonna start tearing things down and
Right.
rebuilding from the studs. Like and AK, said at the end of season press conference, everything's on the table, but he still wants to like move forward. And I
Right.
just don't think that that's really in his DNA. Now that decision might be kind of out of his hands if DeMar DeRozan wants to walk in free agency. And Caruso says, I don't want to sign an extension here. Maybe you are kind of forced into trading him and starting over in
Right.
that way. But I think the Bulls, from what I understand, would like to avoid having to attach assets to move Zach LaVine. But
Mhm.
that's a scenario where you could potentially see them attaching that 11 pick to Zach in order to move him or in order to kind of get something a little bit more valuable back in return. So that could be a situation. But at the end of the day, like they're so with this projected extension for DeRozan coming in at 40 million, and we'll see if that actually happens. depending on what happens with Patrick Williams, like they're going to be really far up against the luxury tax, if not way over it. And so
Yep.
keeping these young players on rookie scale contracts for 4+ years, and then you have restricted rights on them, that's really valuable. And I think that's kind of the way that the league is with these new CBA rules. I think that's
Mhm.
the way the league is kind of forcing teams to build. So I think in an ideal world, they keep that pick. They continue to load up on young players, and that kind of eases the inevitable transition away from DeRozan, whether it's this year or in 2 or 3. Um, so I would be surprised if they did move on from that pick, but certainly if it helps them get something of value for Zach, it could be on the table.
Assuming they keep the pick, who do you think the Bulls will ultimately take? And I know that's hard to, say because the draft and how it's projected is all over the place, and you kind of have no idea who's going to be on the board when the Bulls are on the clock. But I guess maybe let me ask it a different way. How do you think the Bulls will prioritize who to pick, given they're still looking to be competitive? Do they maybe try and go for an older player who is maybe able to start contributing right away, or maybe they still look for a project player who has more upside long term, but will take a few years to really start having an impact?
Yeah, I want to just start by saying that this is like total speculation because I don't have any reporting on who the Bulls are going to be looking at here. But um, we can look at it from a couple of different perspectives. You can look at the best talent available, and in that case, maybe a Ron Holland falls to the Bulls, or maybe Cody Williams, who has been kind of a popular name, maybe even
Mhm.
Isaiah Collier, a guard who had some trouble last year taking care of the basketball, but clearly an NBA build, ready to attack the basket and put pressure on the rim at all times, and really kind of a special playmaker with upside there. So that could be an option. But like you're saying, maybe they want to have someone a little bit more ready to come in and actually contribute. Dalton Connect, I think, would make a lot of sense in that regard. He's about a 6'5", 6'6" wing who can really shoot the ball, who can come off of screens, who can even create his own shot in a lot of ways. So he's somebody who's versatile and I think could fill a big hole for what the Bulls are kind of missing with this current roster. And then you could even go and look at what Arturis has kind of prioritized in previous drafts. And you can say,
Right.
well, look, you got Patrick Williams, you got Io, you got Julian Phillips, Dalen Terry. These are all toolsy, long, big players that can kind of be, if you squint, you can see a guard in them, but also can play a little bit off ball. And I think Cody Williams kind of falls into that category. Devin Carter is a little bit further back in the lottery in a lot of mock drafts, but he's somebody who I could see the Bulls taking. He's kind of a off guard, incredible athlete. He tied the max vertical at the combine with 42 inches. He can really shoot. He can really defend. He kind of reminds me of like a hyper aggressive Io in that way. So I think that kind of guy kind of fits into the mold of what AK likes in the past, or has liked in the past, but they are at a crossroads here. The Bulls are. And so maybe it's time to switch it up. Maybe it's time to get something that's a little bit more ready to produce and contribute on a team that really has some clear needs in the form of shooting and rim protection.
Kind of shifting to that a little bit away from the draft. I mean, it's pretty clear, like you mentioned, a very critical offseason, for this organization, an offseason where we've been promised change, or at least AK has, said that in his end of season press conference. He recognizes the need for change and that the time is now. I think the biggest thing in all of our minds as Bulls fans is, well, how are they going to enact change, meaningful change, right? Because they've expressed the desire to re-sign DeMar. They want to keep Patrick Williams, who is a restricted free agent. Um, it doesn't seem like they're going to be able to get out of the final year of Lonzo's contract off their books by medical retirement, which we can talk about that as well. As of right now, the trade market for Zach LaVine doesn't really seem to have changed from what it was in the deadline. So I guess, how do they make concrete changes to this roster? And maybe a two-part question: has anything changed from what you know or understand in terms of the market for Zach LaVine and Lonzo Ball's injury status of him potentially returning?
Yeah, I mean, that is the big question. My mantra this offseason and really kind of the last trade deadline on has been like, in order to make changes, you're going to have to make big changes. And because of the way that the cap or the Bulls salary cap sheet is constructed, it's just not going to be possible to bring back DeMar at that 40 million number that has been reported by various outlets now, unless you trade Zach LaVine. And to
Right.
your point, it doesn't really seem like there's a lot of interest in Zach around the rest of the league. I think even if teams do become interested in Zach, it will take Paul George to sign somewhere else. It will take Donovan Mitchell or Darius Garland to maybe get traded, and Brandon Ingram. Other dominoes are going to have to fall before
Right.
people become interested in Zach. And so by that time, you're going to be midway into free agency, will DeMar have re-signed by then? The Bulls are probably not going to get themselves caught $15 million past the luxury tax and, coming up on the second apron before they figure out what they can do with Zach.
Right.
And so when I say that, some of this might be out of Arturas's hands as far as what he wants to do, that's kind of what I mean here. I mean, there's no way the Bulls are going into the luxury tax for a team that can't make it out of the play-in, but they clearly still want to compete and get into the playoffs. So how do you do that? Something's got to give. I don't think it's going to be Zach at this time. I think teams just kind of hearing a little bit around the league, like teams are going to want to see Zach and what he looks like coming back from this injury before they're ready to make a trade for him. As I mentioned with the CBA, just really restrictive now in how much money you can hand out to players, especially like second or third options, which is what
Mhm.
Zach would be in an ideal scenario for a lot of teams. So I don't see the Zach situation getting resolved anytime soon, really. And I think that forces the Bulls' hands with Patrick and or DeMar. But even if you can bring those guys back at team-friendly discount deals, well, you're running it back with the same team. And of course, AK said he wanted to make some changes. So
Right.
like I said, something's got to give. I'm not sure what it will be at this point, but I am kind of just sitting here with my bucket of popcorn waiting because I am just so curious to see how they navigate this with, this clear situation of you're up against the tax. You can't really bring in any free agents to make change that way. You don't have a draft pick that could result in an impact player that helps you now. The only way to make change is going to be to trade Zach or let DeMar walk. And where does
Yeah.
that leave you? And so really interesting offseason ahead.
It's funny because I think AK has mentioned this before, and I don't know if he did it in his last end of season presser, but talking about, hey, we got creative in 2021, right?
Yep.
In terms of what we were able to do from a salary cap perspective and the sign and trades that they made for Ball and for DeMar DeRozan. I don't see how they get creative here. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's one thing that you can be creative, but in this scenario, it's like, I mean, you guys on your show have run through all the options of potentially being able to enact change while still being able to be competitive, and it's just not there. Do you think they will ultimately bring DeMar back?
I think they would like to. That seems to be what kind of the reports are indicating at this point. But it just, like I said, it might be out of their hands. Now,
Right,
there are a couple of things they could do. I think this Lonzo Ball contract could be of value to other teams around the league who are trying to shed long-term money. He's going to be an expiring contract, and until he starts playing again, insurance is paying that money, as I believe Sam Smith said on your show a couple weeks ago now. And so that could be enticing. Maybe you attach the pick to that or attach another younger player to that. I think they're going to try to utilize that contract to hopefully bring in some talent. But even if not, like create a little bit more space to be able to do some other stuff. Because that Lonzo contract, I think, is much more palatable to teams than the $43 million contract of Zach LaVine. So, I think they're
right,
going to try to look to trade Vooch. That could be an option. I don't really see a lot of suitors for him. So I think they're just kind of in a situation where they've let their assets depreciate in value to the point where they're not really movable for
right,
positive value anymore. And it becomes really difficult to make changes in that scenario. So I think Caruso and DeMar are really the two guys, and obviously Io and Coby, who it seems like they don't really want to move on from, are the ways that you do that. And so are you going to try to continue to compete? Are you going to try to stay out of the luxury tax? Like, how do you kind of manage both of those things while also enacting change or even running it back at this point? It becomes very
right.
difficult to do that. So we shall see.
I did want to clear something up because there seems to be this misconception that the Bulls can just deem it themselves that they feel that Lonzo Ball is no longer able to play again, and they can therefore just wipe his salary off their books. That's not actually the case, though, right? Because the process would be, a panel of doctors that would all have to determine and confirm his injury to be career-ending, and more importantly, I think you mentioned this before on your show. Lonzo actually has to be in agreement that his career is done, that he's not going to be able to come back, and he's going to retire. Am I correct in that understanding that all those things would need to occur in order for this to actually happen?
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. I've talked to a couple of cap people around the league. And basically like if a team wanted to just remove a guy from their contract and they could just get him medically retired whenever they want, that would happen all the time for bad
Right.
contracts. So I just don't
Right.
think it works that way.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much Lonzo has to be like on board with it or not. Like, if an independent panel of doctors determines his knee is a career ending situation, then I don't know, maybe they can overturn that. But from what I understand, that is not the case. That there does have to be some cooperation from Lonzo's side. And, he's on his podcast saying he's 70%. He could play.
Right. Mhm.
LeVar's on 670 to score saying, he thinks Lonzo will be back in August or September. So it just doesn't really seem like it's trending that way. So you could waive and stretch him, but that leaves you with about $7.1 million of a cap hit on your books for each of the next 3 seasons. And that's why I think kind of moving him could be of use to some teams. Of course, it would just be kind of a bummer to have to give up on him right when he's about to come back after all these years.
Right.
But
Right.
that's the situation that they're in at this point.
Let's talk about Zach LaVine for a little bit. When I saw you when I went to the Bulls game at the United Center at the beginning of the season, this was shortly after all the drama. News broke that both Zach and the Bulls were looking to find a new team for him. And we were talking about it prior to the game, potential trade destinations for Zach. And you were like, I don't know, man. I don't really see it. I don't see a potential trade they're going to be able to find for Zach LaVine. Sure enough, the Bulls, weren't able to trade him. And obviously he's still with the team as of right now. Are you any more confident than you were at the beginning of last season when we talked about that to now in the Bulls' ability to find a trade for Zach? One being that now there's only 3 years left on his deal. Obviously, now, though, the other downside is he's coming off a major injury, so teams aren't able to see him play. But given the fact that it's the offseason, there's probably going to be some, playoff teams that fell short of expectations. They might be a little bit more desperate than they were at the beginning of the year. Do you have any more confidence in terms of the Bulls' ability to find a trade partner for Zach?
I have a little bit more confidence just because I do think there's going to be a lot of movement this summer. And when kind of the merry-go-round stops or whatever the musical chair stops and there's one person left who missed out on all their opportunities to bring in a star player, maybe they do end up looking for Zach. I do not think he's going to be the first domino to fall unless the Bulls just say, like, you know what, just take him, you take the money, we won't ask for anything in return. Maybe a team who has max cap space would want to absorb him and just basically treat it like a free agent signing for 3 years.
Right.
But I just think that other teams are going to be more interested in some of these other options out there. And like I said, maybe Zach does end up getting traded. But I think at that point you are into free agency and will have already had to make decisions on DeRozan and Patrick Williams. And do those things align? And if those things don't align, like, how does that change your future? If DeMar and Patrick walk now, maybe it makes more sense to keep Zach and let him
Right.
rehab his value a little bit to where you can hopefully get something positive at the trade deadline. I think teams are ultimately going to be curious about him. But even like the Pistons, who are kind of like the main team right before the trade deadline, they're hiring a new president of basketball operations. So it's
Right.
maybe not likely that they would be still interested. Obviously, Troy Weaver's still involved. And so, maybe that's a thing, but it's just really hard to say. But I do feel like if it happens, it's not going to be until later on this summer. And even then, I do think teams will feel much more comfortable if they can kind of see him come back and play at a high level before taking that big swing.
So for you, it's more the other dominoes need to fall in place before we really see what Zach LaVine's trade value is going to be, right?
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just a situation where, like, the even like the Magic, who are a team with a lot of cap space, like, I think they're probably going to be more interested in Paul George. They're going to be more interested in maybe a Darius Garland or Donovan Mitchell. Depending on what happens in that situation, there's going to be a lot of teams that are kind of vying for these like secondary stars that are becoming available. And
Right.
Zach's in that category, but I just don't think he's at the top of the list. And so there's potential for him to get moved, but I'm just not confident in the timing of it all kind of aligning in the way that would help the Bulls the most if they do want to bring everybody back.
What would you say are the odds that Zach is in a Bulls uniform on opening night?
Maybe 75-25. I just think it's more likely than not.
In favor of him being with the Bulls, you're saying?
Yeah, because
Yeah.
ideally they're not like attaching picks to get off him. I think even if
Right.
you do kind of recognize that you want to still compete, at the same time, like DeMar's 35. If you give him a 2 to 3 year contract, and you're giving up picks in order to get off of Zach to do that, like, you're kind of setting yourselves back. You really need to start accumulating some of those younger players, even while you're trying to compete, and giving up picks when you've already got one out the door next year. I think that would just be kind of a recipe for disaster long term. So I don't think they're going to want to do that. I think that's been kind of a non-starter for them in the past, and so maybe that changes just because they're in a situation now where they do need to make a decision about DeMar. But I think that would be a really tough pill to swallow. And so at that point, like it's probably better to keep him. That's what happened at the trade deadline.
Right. One thing I forgot to mention, you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier. It was recently announced the Bulls have hired two new assistants, former Wizards head coach in Wes Unseld Jr., Clippers assistant Dan Craig. I personally thought these were good hires as it relates to their level of experience and being offensive-minded coaches. Not sure if it really moves the needle for the Bulls. I think obviously the more important thing is making changes to the roster. But what were your thoughts on the hires and anything additional you can share about these guys?
Yeah, I think very much aligned with what you just said. Like, I think great to have experienced coaches, great to have respected high level coaches that have, competed for championships, that have been through, the head coaching ranks in Wes Unseld's case, who has that experience, who can kind of come in and supplement what Billy does. So, I think it's great that they're doing that. I think to me, it kind of indicates that they're continuing to move forward as opposed to tearing things down, as I mentioned. But I think at the end of the day, like there's only so much you can do with the personnel that you have. And if your personnel does not kind of afford you to play faster, to shoot a lot of threes, to get running up and down, then it's hard to do that. You can't just like tell guys to do stuff that they're not comfortable doing or that they can't
Right.
do. And so I do think there's going to have to be some changes to the actual roster before we actually see any changes. Even just like changing head coaching, I don't think would change a lot of what this team does right now because they're so kind of limited in stylistically what they can do on the court. So I think this is a good first step. It's like the time in the offseason where you can't really sign anybody in free agency. It hasn't started yet. The draft's
Right.
still about 6 weeks away. So this is a good start, but I think there still needs to be a lot more movement this summer. And yeah, I'm just really curious to see how that all kind of unfolds.
Now, conspiracy theory time, and apologies if you guys actually addressed this in a recent pod on CHGO and I just missed it. But some fans are speculating this is Billy Donovan preparing an exit strategy and setting up his replacement should he look to take on a new role, whether it be coaching on a new team or potentially even a front office role with the Bulls. Thoughts on this, and if you think there's any legitimacy to it?
Yeah, we talked about this yesterday. Big Dave was a very
Oh,
big
okay, got it.
proponent of this conspiracy, but I'm not. I think if Billy gets fired or if Billy wants to leave, like I don't see why he would be setting up the next in line for a
Right.
job that he's leaving. Like to me, that's Arturas's MO, and maybe that's him kind of making this call. He worked with Wes Unseld for I believe 5 years in Denver before Unseld moved to Washington. So maybe that's Arturas's doing. But just from Billy's perspective, like I think, and just getting to work with him on a day-to-day basis, like he is so consumed with how things are going on the court today. And so I think some of this like bigger picture stuff is just not his job and not his concern, at least as far as what we can talk to him about. And he's been the focal point and the spokesperson for the organization whenever there are questions about that stuff because Arturas and Mark Eversley just don't speak to the media very often. Um, and so he's had to answer some of those questions, but he's always been consistent about, they tell me when something is imminent. They ask for my information or input when they feel like something is imminent. But for me, it's like I deal with what we have to deal with in the locker room, and I believe we have enough. And so I think that's just kind of his MO at this point. And he maybe is starting to think about what's happening next. He's only got, I believe, 2 more years left on his contract.
Mhm.
But I don't know that he would be like kind of setting up his next in line just because I don't really think that concerns him if he's out the door.
Yeah, well, and let me kind of ask it a different way. And I actually asked Sam Smith when I had him on as well. I mean, the way I look at it, right, is did Billy sign up for this, right? And the reason I say that is because he left OKC because he didn't want to be a part of a rebuild, and obviously the Bulls are not at that stage, but it's possible they could be, right? I mean, if this year really goes horribly, they run it back, and things are just not working the way that they thought it would, they're going to be forced to do that, right? Especially given the fact that they have a pick owed to the Spurs, which is top 10 protected. Do you think Billy would want to stick around in that instance that the Bulls do tear everything down and just go full blown rebuild?
Yeah, I think that's the bigger question, and really the more important one. Like I said, 2 more years on his contract. I think it's really rare that coaches step down. I
Right.
think the idea that it was kind of his decision solely to move on from the OKC rebuild situation is a little bit overblown because his contract was up. I think kind of
Sure,
both
sure.
parties just felt like it was time to move on.
Right.
But certainly, I mean, he has said he was so careful this year not to say like we're underachieving, we're disappointing, we want to be better,
Right.
until after that last Knicks game at Madison Square Garden, when he said, like, do we want to be in the play-in every year? No, we want to be
Right.
competing for, a higher echelon spot in the Eastern Conference. So I think they kind of all know the situation. I think they believe in themselves. And even though they finished ninth, I think they truly internally believe that they could beat this Knicks team in a 7-game series. I think they feel like they could beat the Pacers or whoever it is. Like, I do think, and they competed with those teams this year during the regular season.
Yeah.
So obviously it
Yeah.
didn't work out that way. And the end result is the end result. But their whole thing was like, build with what you've got, get better. Don't necessarily put a ceiling on what you want to accomplish. Like, just continue to build, and kind of all those coach and team cliches that you can think of. But I think, genuinely speaking, that was kind of where they were coming from. And so, if Arturis decides and is allowed by ownership to undergo a rebuild, like, that's his decision, and
Mhm.
Billy has to be on board with that because it's not his decision.
Yeah.
He could certainly step down if he wanted to, but that's a lot of money he's walking away from, and who knows if he would
Right.
get another head coaching job. So, all that to say, I think you make those decisions from a front office perspective with everything in mind. But at the end of the
Mhm.
day, like, if it's best for the organization, then that's what you got to do, even if it isn't necessarily in line with what some of your employees may want.
Well, I'll get you out of here on this. What's going to be the biggest surprise in your view that will happen this offseason for the Bulls?
Um, Wow. I think it's going to be kind of this decision between Patrick and DeMar, because I'm
Mhm.
sorry, Zach and DeMar, because I do think ultimately it's going to be very challenging to bring both of them back.
Yeah.
Um, I think they're going to look to trade Zach. That's certainly something they're going to be aggressive with. Arturis mentioned that he was going to be much more aggressive this offseason. I believe that's what he was referring to. But what if he can't find it? And is
Yeah.
that going to kind of force DeMar out the door? Because, the thing with DeMar is anybody else going to offer him $40 million? Is anybody else going to offer him 30 or even 25?
Yeah.
Who knows? But is there a better chance that he, wants to, if the money isn't that much better in Chicago, why wouldn't he want to go play for a team that could actually compete at a much higher level? So, like, maybe 30 million for the Bulls and 15 million for another team is more like in line. And so in order to kind of keep him and get him to stay, you have to overpay him even more. So I don't think it's just like, here, DeMar, sign the dotted line because we're offering you $1 more than the next highest bidder. I think the
Yeah.
situation and the money kind of does weigh itself out a little bit differently. And so, certainly he says he wants to come back. I think there's a lot of dollars and reasons why that would be the case. But if the Bulls can't afford to give him that kind of paycheck, does he still want to come back? And I guess
Right.
that remains to be seen. So I think we are at kind of a crossroads here where it has to be one or the other, unless, some other big changes with the roster happens and you can kind of offload Vooch and Lonzo's money and create space to bring it back. But I just don't necessarily see that happening either. So something's got to give this summer, and I'm just curious to see who is coming back and who's on the way out.
Yeah, well, we're all gonna be waiting. Like you said, it's just kind of, sitting with our popcorn, waiting for some of these dominoes to fall and, getting the postseason, wrapped up and seeing where the Bulls kinda take things from there. Hopefully, nothing crazy happens while you're on vacation. I don't think it will given the
Yes,
fact
that
that
would be not ideal timing.
Yeah, but Will, as always, man, appreciate you, making the time, means a lot. Keep up the great work over at CHGO, and, be sure to tell the guys I said hello, and enjoy the, rest of the off season.
We'll do it, and same to you. Always a blast coming on and talking with you. So hope to be back soon. And
For
we got to
sure.
get you on our show soon too.
I'm always down, man. You guys let me know. I'm ready. But anyway, thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you guys in the next one.